The Thing Around Your Neck by CHIMAMANDA ADICHIE. You thought everybody in America had a car and a gun. Your uncles and aunts had and cousins that thought so too. Right after you won the American visa lottery, they told you in a month you will have a big car, soon a big house, but don't buy a gun like those Americans. They trooped into the room in Lagos where you lived with your father and mother and the three siblings, leaning against the unpainted walls because there weren't enough the chairs to go round, to say goodbye in loud voices and tell you with the lowered voices what they wanted you to send them. In comparison to the bigger car and house and the possibly gun, the things that they wanted were minor handbags and shoes and perfumes and clothes. You said, okay, no problem. Your uncle in America, who had put in the names of all your family members for the American visa lottery, said you could live with him until you got on your feet. He picked you up at the airport and bought you a big hot dog with yellow mustard that nauseated you. Introduction to America, he said with a laugh. He lived in a small white town in Maine, in a 30-year-old house by a lake. He told you that the company he worked for had offered him a few thousand more than the average salary plus the stock options because they were desperately trying to look diverse. They included a photo of him in every brochure, even those that had nothing to do with his unit. He laughed and said the job was good, was the worth living in an old white town, even though his wife had to drive an hour to find a hair salon that did black hair. The trick was to understand America, to know that America was give and take. You gave up a lot, but you gained a lot too. He showed you how to apply for a cashier job in the gas station on Main Street, and he enrolled you in a community college where the girls had thick thighs and wore bright red nail polish and self the tanner that made them look orange. They asked where you learned to speak the English and if you had real houses back in Africa and if you had seen a car before you came to America. They gawked at your hair. Does it stand up or fall down when you take out the braids? They wanted to know all of it stands up. How? Why? Do you use a comb? You smiled tightly when they asked those questions. Your uncle told you to expect it, a mixture of ignorance and arrogance, he called it. Then he told you how the neighbors said a few months after he moved into his house that the squirrels had started to disappear. They had heard that Africans are all kinds of the wild animals. You laughed with your uncle and you felt at home in his house. His wife called you Nwani, sister, and his two school-age children called you auntie. They spoke Igbo and ate dairy for lunch and it was like home. Until your uncle came into the cramped basement where you slept with all the boxes and cartons and pulled you forcefully to him, squeezing your buttocks, moaning. He wasn't really your uncle. He was actually a brother of your father's sister's husband, not related my blood. After you pushed him away, he sat on your bed. It was his house. After all, and he smiled and said you were no longer a child at 22. If you let him, he would do many things for you. Smart women did it all the time. How did you think? Those the women that back the home in the Lagos with the well-paid jobs that made it. Even women in New York City. You locked yourself in the bathroom until he went back upstairs, and the next morning you left. The walking along the windy road, smelling the baby, the fish in the lake. You saw him drive fast. He had always dropped you off at Main Street and he didn't honk. You wondered what he would tell his wife, why you had left, and you remembered what he said, that America was give and take. You ended up in Connecticut in another little town because it was the last stop of the Greyhound bus that you got on. You walked into the restaurant with a bright, clean evening and said you would work for $2 less than the other waitress. The manager Juan had inky black hair and smiled to show a gold tooth. He said he had never had a Nigerian employee, but all immigrants that worked hard. He knew he had been there. He would pay you $1 less, but under the table he didn't like all the taxes that they were making him pay. You could not afford to go to school because now you pay the rent for the tiny room with the stained carpet. Besides, the small Connecticut town didn't have a community college and the credits at the state university that cost too much. So you went to the public library, you looked up the course, the syllabi on school websites and read some of the books. Sometimes you sat on the lumpy mattress of your twin bed and thought about home, your aunts who hawked dried fish and plantains, cajoling customers to buy and then the shouting insults when they didn't, your uncles who drank the local gin and crammed their families and lived into single rooms, your friends who had come out to say the goodbye before you left, to rejoice because they won the American Visa lottery, to confess their envy, the parents who often held hands as they walked to the church on the Sunday mornings, the neighbors from the next room laughing and teasing them, your father who brought back his bosses all the newspapers from work and made your brothers read them, your mother whose salary was barely enough to pay your brothers the school fees at the secondary school where teachers gave when someone slipped them a brown envelope. You had never needed to pay for and never slipped a brown envelope to a teacher in the secondary school. Still you chose long brown envelopes to send off your month's earnings to your parents at the address of the parastatal where your mother was a cleaner. You always use the dollar notes that the yuan. They gave you because those were crisp. Unlike the tips, every month you wrapped the money carefully in a white paper, but you didn't write a letter. There was nothing to write about. In later weeks, though, you wanted to write because you had stories to tell. You wanted to write about the surprising the openness of people in America, how eagerly they told you about their mother the fighting cancer, about their sister-in-laws the preemie, the kinds of things that one should hide or should reveal only to the family members who wish them well. You wanted to write about the way the people they left so much the food on their plates and crumpled a few dollar bills down as though it was an offering expiation for the wasted food. You wanted to write about the child who started to cry and pulled at her blonde hair and pushed the menus off the table, and instead of the parents making her shut up, they pleaded with her the child of perhaps 5 years old, and then they all got up and left. You wanted to write about the rich people who wore shabby clothes and tattered sneakers, who looked like the night watchmen in front of the larger compounds in Lagos. You wanted to write that rich Americans were thin and the poor Americans were fat, and that many did not have a big house and car. You still were not sure about the guns though, because they might have them inside their pockets. It wasn't just to your parents that you wanted to write, it was also to your friends and cousins and aunts and uncles. But you could never afford enough the perfumes and the clothes and the handbags and shoes to go around and still pay your rent on what you earned at the waitressing job, so you wrote to nobody. Nobody knew where you were because you told no one. Sometimes you felt invisible and tried to walk through your room the wall into the halfway, and when you bumped into the wall, it left bruises on your arms. Once Juan asked if you had a man that hit you because he would take care of him, and you laughed a mysterious laugh. At night, something would wrap itself around your neck, something that very nearly choked you before you fell asleep. Many people at the restaurant asked when you had come from Jamaica, because they thought that every black person with a foreign accent was Jamaican. Or some who guessed that you were the African told you that they loved elephants and wanted to go on a safari. So when he asked you in the dimness of the restaurant after you recited the daily specials what African country you were from, you said Nigeria, and expected him to say that he had donated money to fight AIDS in Botswana. But he asked if you were Yoruba or Igbo because you didn't have a Fulani face. You were surprised. You thought he must be a professor of anthropology at the State University, a little young in his late 20s or so, but who was to say? Igbo, you said. He asked your name and said Akuna was pretty. He did not ask what it meant, fortunately, because you were sick of how people said father's wealth. You mean like your father will actually send you to a husband. He told you he had been to Ghana and Uganda and Tanzania, loved the poetry of Okot Bitek and the novels of Amos Tutuola, and had read a lot about sub-Saharan African countries, their histories, their complexities. You wanted to feel the disdain to show it has the you brought his the order, because the white people who liked Africa too much and those who liked Africa too little were the same, they sinned him. But he didn't shake his head in the superior the way that Professor Cobble Dick back in the main community college did during a class discussion on decolonization in Africa. He didn't have that expression of a professor, the Cobble Dicks, that expression of a person who thought himself the better than the people he knew about. He came in the next day and sat at the same table, and when you asked if the chicken was okay, he asked if you had grown up in Lagos. He came in the third day and began talking before he ordered about how he had visited Bombay and now they wanted to visit the Lagos to see how real people lived, like in the shanty towns, because he never did any of the silly tourist stuff when he was abroad. He talked, and you had to tell him it was against the restaurant policy. He brushed your hand when you set the glass of water down. The fourth day, when you saw him arrive, you told Juan you didn't want that table anymore. After your shift that night, he was waiting outside, earphones stuck in his ears, asking you to go out with him because your name rhymed with Hakuna Matata, and Lion the King was the only Maudlin, the movie he had ever liked. You didn't know what the Lion King was. You looked at him in the bright light and noticed that his eyes were the color of extra virgin olive oil, a greenish gold. Extra virgin olive oil was the only thing you loved, truly loved, in America. He was a senior at the State University. He told you how old he was, and you asked why he had not graduated yet. This was America, after all. It was not like the back home, where universities closed so often that people added 3 years to their normal course of study, and the lectures went on strike after strike and still were not paid. He said he had taken a couple of years off to discover himself and travel, mostly to Africa and Asia. You asked him where he ended up finding himself, and he laughed. You did not laugh. You did not know that people could simply choose not to go to school, that people could dictate to life. You were used to accepting what life gave, writing down what life dictated. You said no the following 4 days to going out with him because you were uncomfortable with the way he looked at your face, that intense, consuming the way he looked at your face that made you say goodbye to him, but also made you reluctant to walk away. And then, the fifth night, you panicked when he was not standing at the door after your shift. You prayed for the first time in a long time, and when he came up behind you and said, "Hey," you said yes, you would go out with him. Even before he asked, you were scared he would not ask again. The next day, he took you to dinner at the Chang's, and your fortune cookie had two strips of paper. Both of them were blank. You knew that you had become comfortable when you told him that you watched Jeopardy on the restaurant TV, and you rooted for the following in this order: women of color, black men, and white women before the finally white men, which meant you never rooted for white men. He laughed and told you he was used to not being rooted for. His mother taught women's studies. And you knew that you had become close when you told him that your father was really not a school teacher in Lagos, that he was a junior driver for a construction company. And you told him about that day in Lagos, the traffic in the rickety Peugeot, the 504 your father drove. It was raining and your seat was wet because of the rust-eaten hole in the roof. The traffic was heavy. The traffic was always heavy in Lagos, and when it rained, it was chaos. The roads became muddy ponds, and the cars got stuck, and some of your cousins went out and made some money pushing the cars out. The rain, the swampiness, you thought made your father step on the brakes too late that day. You heard the bump before you felt it. The car your father rammed into was the white, foreign, and dark green with the golden headlights like the eyes of a leopard. Your father started to cry and beg even before he got out of the car and laid himself flat on the road, causing the much blowing of horns. Sorry sir, he chanted. If you sell me and my family, you cannot buy even one tire on your car. Sorry, sir. The big man seated at the back did not come out, but his driver did, examining the damage, looking at your father's proud form from the corner of his eye, as though the pleading was like the pornography performance that he was ashamed to admit he enjoyed. At last he let your father go, waved him away. The other cars, the horns, the blew, and the drivers crashed when your father came back into the car. You refused to look at him because he was just like the pigs that wallowed in the marshes around the market. Your father looked like inside shit. After you told him this, he pursed his lips and held your hand and said he understood how you felt. You shook your hand free, suddenly annoyed, because he thought the world was ought to be full of people like him. You told him there was nothing to understand. It was just the way it was. He found the African store in the Hartford Yellow Pages and drew you there because of the way he walked around with the familiarity, tilting the bottle of palm the wine to see how much sediment it had. The Ghanaian store owner asked him if he was African, like the white Kenyans or South Africans, and he said yes, but he had been in America for a long time. He looked pleased that the store owner had believed him. You cooked that evening with the things that you had bought, and after he ate gari and onugbu soup, he threw up in your sink. You didn't mind though, because now you would be able to cook onugbu soup with meat. He didn't eat meat because he thought it was the wrong way they killed animals. He said they released the fear toxins into the animals, and the fear toxins that made people paranoid. Back home, the meat pieces that you ate, when there was meat, were the size of half your finger, but you did not tell him that. You did not tell him either that the dawa cubes your mother cooked everything with, because the curry and the thyme that were too expensive, had MSG, were MSG. He said MSG they caused cancer. It was the reason he liked, changed, Chang didn't cook with MSG. Once at Chang's, he told the waiter he had recently visited Shanghai, that he spoke some Mandarin. The waiter warmed up and told him what soup was the best, and then asked him, "You have a girlfriend in Shanghai now?" And he smiled and said nothing. You lost your appetite. The region deep in your chest felt clogged. That night, you didn't mourn when he was inside you. You bit your lips and pretended that you didn't come because you knew he would worry. Later, you told him why you were upset. That even though you went to Chang's so often together, even though you had kissed just before the meals came, the Chinese man had assumed you could not possibly be his girlfriend, and he had smiled and said nothing. Before he apologized, he gazed at you blankly, and you knew that he did not understand. He bought you the presents, and when you objected about the cost, he said his grandfather in Boston had been wealthy, but hastily added that the old man had given a lot away, and so the trust fund he had wasn't huge. His presence mystified you. A fist-sized glass ball that you shook to watch a tiny, shapely doll in pink spin around. A shiny rock whose surface took on the color of whatever touched it. An expensive scarf hand painted in Mexico. Finally, you told him, your voice stretched in the irony, that in your life the presents were always useful. The rock, for instance, would work, or if you could grind things with it. He laughed long and hard, but you did not laugh. You realized that in his life he could buy the presents that were just the presents and nothing else, nothing useful. When he started to buy you shoes and clothes and books that you asked him not to, you didn't want any presents at all. He bought them anyway, and you kept them for your cousins and uncles and aunts, for when you would one day be able to visit home, even though you did not know how you could even ever afford a ticket and you rent. He said he really wanted to see Nigeria and he could pay for you the boat to go. You did not want him to pay for you to visit home. You did not want him to go to Nigeria to add it to the list of countries the way he went to gawk at the lives of poor people who could never go back at his life. You told him this on a sunny day when he took you to see Long Island Sound, and the two of you argued, your voices raised as you walked along the calm water. He said, you were wrong to call him self-righteous. You said he was the wrong to call only the poor Indians in the Bombay the real Indians. Did it mean he wasn't a real American? Since he was not like the poor, the fat people that you and he had seen in Hartford. He hurried ahead of you, his upper the body bare and pale, his flip-flops raising bits of sand, but then he came the back and held out his hand for yours. You made up and made loud and ran your hands through each other's hair, his soft and yellow like the swinging tassels of growing corn, yours the dark and bouncy like the filling of a pillow. He had got too much the sun, and his skin turned the color of a ripe watermelon, and you kissed his back before you rubbed lotion on it. The thing that wrapped itself around your neck that nearly chopped you before you fell asleep started to loosen, to let go. You knew by the people's reactions that you too were abnormal, the way the nasty ones were too nasty and the nice ones too nice. The old white men and women who muttered and glared at him, the black men who shook their heads at you, the black women whose pitying eyes bemoaned your lack of self-esteem, your self-loathing, or the black women who smiled swift solidarity smiles, the black men who tried too hard to forgive you, saying a too obvious hi to him, the white men and women who said, what a good-looking pair, too brightly, too loudly, as though to prove their own open-mindedness to themselves. But his parents were different. They almost made you think it was all normal. His mother told you that he had never brought a girl to meet them except for his high school prom date, and he grinned stiffly and held your hand. The tablecloth shielded your clasped hands. He squeezed your hand and you squeezed back and wondered why he was so stiff, why his extra virgin olive oil colored eyes that darkened as he spoke to his parents. His mother was delighted when she asked if you had read Nawal el-Sadawi, and you said yes. His father asked how similar Indian food was to Nigerian food and teased you about the pain when the check came. You looked at them, they felt grateful that they did not examine you like an exotic trophy and ivory tusk. Afterwards, he told you about his issues with his parents, how they portioned out love like a birthday cake, how they would give him a bigger slice if only he would agree to go to law school. You wanted to sympathize, but instead you were angry. You were angrier when he told you he had refused to go up to Canada with them for a week or two to their summer cottage in the Quebec countryside. They had even asked him to bring you. He showed you pictures of the cottage, and you wondered why it was called a cottage, because the buildings that big around your neighborhood back home were banks and churches. You dropped a glass and it shattered on the hardwood of his apartment floor, and he asked what was wrong, and you said nothing, although you thought a lot was wrong. Later in the shower, you started to cry. You watched the water dilute your tears, and you didn't know why you were crying. You wrote home finally a short letter to your parents that slipped in between the crisp dollar bills, and you included your address. You got a reply only days later by courier. Your mother wrote the letter herself. You knew from the spidery penmanship, from the misspelled words. Your father was dead. He had slumped over the steering the wheel of the company the car the 5 months now she wrote. They had used some of the money you sent to give him a good funeral. They killed a goat for the guest and buried him in a good coffin. You curled up in bed, pressed your knees to your chest, and tried to remember what you had been doing when your father died, what you had been doing for all the months when he was already dead. Perhaps your father died on the day your whole body had been covered in goosebumps, hard as uncooked rice that you could not explain. Joanne teasing you about taking over from the chef so that the heat in the kitchen would warm you up. Perhaps your father died on one of the days that you took a drive to Mystic, or watched a play in Manchester, or had dinner at the Chang's. He held you while you cried, smoothed your hair, and offered to buy your ticket to go with you to see your family. You said no, you needed to go alone. He asked if you would come back, and you reminded him that you had a green card and you would lose it if you did not come back in 1 year. He said you knew what he meant. Would you come back? Come back. You turned away and said nothing. And when he drove you to the airport, you hugged him tight for a long moment, and then you let go.